At nearly 7 a.m. on January 8, 2018, in a quiet home in the town of Nailsea, Somerset, two young children woke up and realized that something was wrong. One was a 6-year-old boy. Beside him was his little brother, just 3 years old. At an age when an ordinary morning should have begun with calling for their mother, eating breakfast, and getting ready for a new day, Rory was about to face something no child should ever have to experience. His mother wasn't responding. She wasn't moving. She wouldn't wake up. And so, a 6-year-old boy did the only thing he thought he could do. He called 999. On the other end of the line, an emergency call began. Not from an adult. Not from a witness prepared for what they were about to see, but from a child trying to explain that his mother was lying there, completely motionless. Just minutes later, police were dispatched to the house on Brendan Gardens. But by the time they stepped inside, there was nothing left to save. Claire Taverner was dead. She was only 27 years old. A mother. A daughter. A young woman who, just hours earlier, had still been alive inside that very home. But what makes this case so haunting is not simply the way Claire died. It is the question of what happened in the hours before those two children woke up. Who had been inside that house? What happened that turned what appeared to be an ordinary night into a horrifying morning that Rory and Blake would never forget? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, was this truly a tragedy that came completely without warning? Or, before Claire died, had there already been signs that only became clear in hindsight, that something had been quietly building toward an irreversible ending? Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're taking a closer look at the story of Claire Taverner, a case that began with a desperate emergency call from a 6-year-old boy, but behind that call was an entire chain of events that, when pieced together, revealed a picture far more heartbreaking than what anyone could see on that morning. But before we continue, if you enjoy true crime stories told through investigation, analysis, and a careful examination of every detail to uncover what really happened, make sure to subscribe to the channel and support us. Your support gives us the motivation to continue creating even better and higher quality videos in the future. Now, let's turn back the clock, because before she became a name in a murder case, Claire Taverner was a woman with a life of her own. She loved animals, especially horses. She worked part-time at a bar in Nailsea and was remembered by those around her as friendly and approachable. But above all else, Claire was the mother of two young boys. Rory, 6 years old, and Blake, 3. About 7 months before the murder, the family had moved into the house on Brendan Gardens. To the neighbors, they appeared to be an ordinary family. A young mother, a husband, 2 small children. A life unfolding behind the doors of a home in a quiet residential neighborhood. No one looking at the morning of January 7 could have known that, just one day later, that same house would become the scene of a murder. And perhaps that sense of normality is what makes this case so unsettling. Because sometimes, the greatest tragedies do not begin with a scream that everyone can hear. They begin with small cracks that those on the outside cannot see. Because behind the closed doors of Claire's home, the marriage that appeared normal to everyone else was slowly beginning to change. And to understand what happened on the night of January 7, 2018, we need to take a closer look at the man who lived with Claire in that very house. Andrew Taverner, her husband, and later, the man who admitted to killing her. Before we move on to the next part, I want to ask you a question and hear your thoughts. In cases involving violence within a family, which do you think is more concerning? A. A violent act that appears suddenly, with no warning and no way for anyone to predict it. B. Small warning signs that were already there but were only recognized after the tragedy had happened. Comment A or B and share your thoughts. Because as Claire's story continues to unfold, that very question may change the way we look at this entire case. Andrew Taverner was 18 years older than Claire. On paper, that may seem like nothing more than a detail about their ages. Andrew was 45. Claire was just 27. They were married, had 2 young sons, and lived together in a house on Brendan Gardens. But behind those brief facts was a marriage that was slowly approaching its breaking point. And what is important to understand is that, in order to make sense of what happened on the night Claire died, we cannot look only at the final few hours, because a case like this is rarely explained by a single moment. Behind it is often a chain of events, conflicts, arguments, periods of time that may seem to have simply passed, and sometimes warning signs that, when they first appeared, gave no indication that they would later become important pieces of the larger story. Andrew worked as a tree surgeon. To those who knew the family only from the outside, there appeared to be nothing particularly unusual about their lives. They were a married couple. They had children. They lived in an ordinary residential neighborhood. But one of the most important things to remember in cases involving violence within a family is this: the life neighbors see is not always the life being lived inside the home. A neighbor may see the entire family going out together. They may see the children playing outside. They may run into them on an ordinary morning. But once the door closes, outsiders cannot know everything that is happening inside a relationship. And in Claire and Andrew's marriage, those problems had existed long before January 2018. According to information later mentioned in connection with the case, alcohol was one of the factors present in the context of their marriage. Problems related to drinking were said to have contributed to tensions between the two. But alcohol, by itself, cannot explain the entire story. And it certainly cannot serve as an excuse for what happened afterward. Because what makes Claire's story even more significant is another detail, a detail that occurred years before she was killed. In 2015, Claire reported 2 incidents of violence to the police. 3 years before the horrifying morning of January 8, 2018, there had already been moments when Claire turned to the authorities to report what was happening. Looking back today, that detail is almost impossible to ignore. But that does not mean that, in 2015, everyone could have foreseen the future. This is an important distinction to make fairly and accurately. After a tragedy, we often look back at the past and see warning signs far more clearly than they appeared at the time. What was once just an incident, a phone call, a police report, a conflict between 2 people, can later become part of a much larger pattern. But at the time, no one could know with certainty what the final outcome would be. Still, the fact that the future could not be predicted does not mean those warning signs were unimportant. Because one of the most troubling aspects of stories like this is the difference between looking at a single act in isolation and looking at an entire pattern of behavior. One argument may be just one argument, but when it exists alongside previous reports of violence, ongoing tension, and a relationship that is steadily deteriorating, the picture begins to look very different. And that is why, when looking at Claire's story, the events of 2015 cannot simply be dismissed as an unrelated detail. They became part of a past that after Claire was gone, people were forced to revisit. After those reports, life continued. And perhaps that is what makes stories involving domestic violence so complicated. An incident does not always immediately end a relationship. People do not always leave right away. And those on the outside do not always see the full extent of what is happening. Claire and Andrew continued with their lives. They had a family, 2 young children. They moved into a new home. And from the outside, their lives may still have appeared completely ordinary. But a new house does not always mean a new beginning. And the continuation of a life together does not mean that the problems of the past have disappeared. Sometimes, unresolved issues are simply pushed into the background, until, at some point, they resurface. By the beginning of 2018, Claire and Andrew's marriage was beginning to fall apart. Their relationship was coming to an end. And that breakdown was not happening in a vacuum. Andrew was said to believe that Claire was involved with another man. Suspicion entered the relationship, and with it came jealousy. This is a particularly important point when telling this story. Because in cases involving violence between intimate partners, it can be easy to describe jealousy as though it somehow explains the perpetrator's actions. But understanding the context is not the same as excusing the violence. Andrew may have been suspicious. He may have been angry. He may have felt hurt by the fact that his marriage was ending. But none of those emotions could ever make violence acceptable. A person has the right to leave a marriage. A person has the right to begin a new life. And the end of a relationship is never a reason for the other person to take their life. But as the marriage moved closer to collapse, The atmosphere between Claire and Andrew became increasingly tense. Try to imagine that situation. Inside the house on Brendan Gardens were two people living in a marriage that was no longer intact. One may have been trying to move on from the relationship. The other was facing the breakdown of that marriage, suspicion, and the feeling of losing the life they once had. Alongside that were problems that had existed before: alcohol, conflict, and previous reports of violence dating back to 2015. No single factor, on its own, can fully explain what happened. But when those factors appear together within the same story, they force us to ask a question. What was really happening behind the doors of a home that, from the outside, still appeared to belong to an ordinary family? That is also one of the most important things to reflect on in Claire's story. Violence within a relationship does not always begin with an act that everyone immediately recognizes. Sometimes, it exists in behavior that the people involved try to hide. In phone calls the neighbors never hear, in moments when someone says everything will be fine, or in periods of calm that convince everyone that the problem has truly gone away. But calm does not always mean that the danger has disappeared. And the continuation of a relationship does not always mean that what happened before has been resolved. By early January 2018, all of those elements appeared to be present at the same time. A marriage that was breaking down. Suspicion, jealousy, problems involving alcohol, and a history that included previous reports of violence. Meanwhile, Rory and Blake were still very young children. They lived in that same house. And that is what makes this story even more heartbreaking. Because when adults become trapped in conflicts they cannot resolve, children often have no choice but to remain in the situation. They do not decide where they will live. They do not decide whether their parents will stay together. They do not decide what happens between the adults around them. But they are still forced to live with the consequences. And in the story of the Taverner family, those consequences would eventually go far beyond any argument or broken marriage. Looking back at everything that happened before January 2018, perhaps the most frightening thing is not any single detail. Not alcohol alone. Not jealousy alone. Not the reports made in 2015. But the way all of those factors existed within the same story. Piece by piece. Over several years. Until the marriage reached a point where it could no longer continue as it once had. And then came Sunday evening, January 7th, 2018. An evening that, at least at first, no one outside that house could have imagined would be any different from countless others. There was no warning written across the sky, no sign on that quiet street that, within just a few hours, a family would be changed forever. But inside that house, the tensions were no longer part of the past. They were still there. Under the same roof. At the same moment. And before the next morning began, Claire Taverner would become the victim of an attack that would not only change her fate forever, but would also change the lives of her two young sons forever. Sunday evening, January 7th, 2018. As night fell over the town of Nailsea, life outside the house on Brendan Gardens appeared to be continuing as usual. There were no police lights, no sirens. No one on that quiet street knew that before the next morning began, a 27-year-old woman would be dead. Inside the house was Claire Taverner, the mother of two young children, and also Andrew Taverner. The man police would later identify as the person who had taken her life. What happened during Claire's final hours was not only the most tragic part of this story, it was also the moment when all the tensions that had existed before finally led to an irreversible outcome. A marriage falling apart. Suspicion, jealousy, long-standing conflict. All of it had formed part of this family's story. But that night, Claire would not get the chance to move beyond it. According to what was later established, Andrew attacked Claire inside their home. The attack did not happen in a single instant. The injuries found on Claire's body would later become an important part of reconstructing what had happened. She was stabbed a total of 10 times. Some of the most serious wounds were to her neck. Claire also suffered injuries to her hands and arms. For investigators, those details carried particular significance. Because injuries do not simply tell us that someone was attacked. Sometimes, they can also reveal how that person reacted in their final moments. The injuries to Claire's hands and arms were considered consistent with defensive wounds. That suggests that, during at least part of the attack, Claire tried to protect herself. It is a heartbreaking detail, because behind a brief line in a forensic report is a moment we can never fully see. A woman realizing that she was in danger. The instinctive reaction of raising her hands to protect her body, an attempt to stop what was happening. But in the end, Claire did not survive. At some point during that night, the house fell silent. Claire was dead. And what makes that silence even more haunting is that her two young children were still inside the same house. Rory was just 6 years old. Blake was only 3. They were not old enough to understand everything that had been happening between the adults. They could not understand how complicated a collapsing marriage could become. They could not understand the jealousy, the conflict, or the problems that had existed for years. But the following morning, they would come face to face with the consequences. In some murder cases, the victim is discovered by a neighbor, a friend, a coworker, or a police officer. But in Claire's story, the first person to realize that something was wrong was her 6-year-old son. At nearly 7 a.m. on January 8th, Rory and Blake found their mother. And that moment brings the entire story back to where we began. A phone call, a young voice, a child trying to do something that should never have been his responsibility. Rory called 999. He tried to explain that his mother was not responding, that something was wrong. At 6 years old, Rory may not have fully understood the meaning of death, but he understood that his mother needed help. And in that moment, he turned to the emergency services. There is something particularly heartbreaking about that call. A 6-year-old child would normally call for his mother when he was frightened, but that morning, Rory could not call for his mother, because the person he had always been able to turn to could no longer answer him. So instead, he had to call a stranger, an emergency operator on the other end of the line. And perhaps that was the moment when his childhood was divided into 2 parts. Before the call, and after the call. Not long afterward, emergency services were dispatched to the house on Brendan Gardens. But by the time police entered, Claire could no longer be saved. The murder investigation had begun. But Andrew Taverner was not at the scene. He had already left the house. And while police began securing and investigating the scene, Andrew made his way to Nailsea and Backwell railway station. What happened next made the case even more disturbing. Andrew attempted to take his own life by lying in front of an approaching train. He survived, but he suffered severe injuries to his left hand and lost several fingers. Andrew's suicide attempt does not erase what had happened before, nor can it automatically tell us exactly what was going through his mind at that moment. Was it despair? A breakdown after realizing the consequences of his actions? Fear of what was about to happen? Or something else entirely? Without evidence from the case record, we cannot say for certain. But one thing is clear: after Claire was killed, Andrew did not remain at the house to face the police. And at the railway station, he carried out an act that left him seriously injured. When police approached Andrew, the story began to take another turn. Andrew admitted that he had killed Claire. In many murder cases, a confession is something investigators spend days, months, or even years trying to obtain. But in this case, Claire's husband admitted to the very act that the investigation had only just begun to uncover. That did not make the tragedy any simpler. If anything, it only changed the questions. If the identity of the killer was no longer the biggest mystery, then what had actually happened inside that house? How did the attack begin? What happened between Claire and Andrew before she was killed? And how were all the warning signs that had appeared in the years before connected to this final night? After being taken for treatment for the injuries he sustained at the railway station, Andrew remained under the supervision of the authorities. Only when his condition allowed was he able to enter the formal questioning process. On February 1, 2018, Andrew Taverner was charged with murder. But for the 2 boys, the day their lives changed forever was not February 1. It was not the day Andrew was charged. And it was not the day he would later appear in court. Everything had already changed on the morning of January 8. The moment they realized their mother was not responding. The moment Rory picked up the phone and called for help. And perhaps that is one of the reasons this case leaves such a heavy feeling behind. Because after all the analysis of motive, evidence, and legal responsibility, one simple truth remains. Claire was dead, 2 children had lost their mother, and the man who had built a family with her, the father of those children, would later become the man charged with killing her. In just a matter of hours, a family home had become the scene of a murder. A 27-year-old woman was no longer alive. A man was seriously injured and taken into police custody, and 2 young children were placed at the center of a tragedy they had done nothing to create. But the 999 call was only the beginning of a much longer process. Because once the scene was secured, investigators began doing what they must always do after a killing. They began looking back, at every room, every trace, every injury, every statement, and every event from the past. Andrew had admitted to killing Claire, but a confession answered only part of the story. The evidence would have to answer the rest. And as investigators began putting the missing pieces together, they saw more than just one night of violence. They began to see an entire chain of events that had existed long before that night, the warning signs, the conflicts. And one question that remained after Claire was gone: was this truly a tragedy that no one could have seen coming? Or had the truth been there all along, hidden in plain sight, until it was finally too late to see the full picture? After Andrew Taverner admitted to killing Claire, one of the biggest questions in the case appeared to have been answered. Who was responsible? Andrew. But for investigators, that was only the beginning. Because an admission alone cannot reconstruct the entire truth. It cannot tell investigators exactly how the attack unfolded. It cannot replace what the crime scene itself reveals. And it cannot answer one of the most important questions in any criminal trial: the level of intent behind the act. So after Claire's death, the house on Brendan Gardens was no longer simply the place where a tragedy had occurred. It became the place where the final pieces of the story had to be found. Investigators began piecing together what remained, not through emotion, not through speculation, but through evidence that could be proven. And Claire's body became one of the most important sources of information. The post-mortem examination showed that she had been stabbed a total of 10 times. 2 of the most serious wounds were to her neck. Claire also had injuries to her hands and arms that were considered consistent with defensive wounds. These details made the case about far more than a simple number. 10 stab wounds were not just 10 lines in a forensic report. Because behind those injuries were the final moments Claire experienced. The wounds to her hands and arms suggested that, during at least part of the attack, she had not remained completely passive. She had tried to protect herself. An instinctive reaction. Raising her hands, trying to defend herself, trying to create distance between herself and the danger. That is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of forensic reports. Because the language of forensic science is inherently clinical. It speaks of wound locations, the number of injuries, the cause of death. But when those facts are placed within the context of a human life, they tell a very different story. Claire was not simply a victim who was found on the morning of January 8. She was a woman who tried to survive, and the evidence on her body preserved part of that truth. In a murder investigation, details such as the number of injuries, their location, and the presence of defensive wounds can carry particular significance. They can help prosecutors and the court assess the nature of an attack and consider the question of intent. Because in the eyes of the law, the fact that someone has died is not the only question. How that death occurred also matters. Under what circumstances was the act committed? Did the person responsible intend to cause serious harm or to take a life? Those questions cannot be answered simply through the emotions that follow a tragedy. They must be built upon evidence. And in Claire's case, what investigators found contributed to a picture of an attack whose severity could not be denied. But forensic evidence could answer only part of the story. Because even if investigators understood the level of violence involved, another question remained. What had led to it? At this point, the story begins to return to what had happened before January 8, a marriage that was falling apart. Andrew's suspicion that Claire was involved with another man, problems involving alcohol, and a history of violent incidents that Claire had previously reported to the police. When each factor is viewed separately, it may carry a different meaning. A failing marriage does not automatically mean violence. Jealousy does not automatically lead to murder. And problems with alcohol do not automatically turn someone into a killer. But investigating a case is not about searching for one single cause that can explain everything. Sometimes, what matters most is looking at the entire context. Looking at how different factors appear, persist, and affect a relationship over time. And when we look at Claire's story, one issue begins to stand out more clearly. This marriage was not simply coming to an end. It was ending against a background in which violence had already existed. That is an important distinction, because not every separation is dangerous. But in relationships where there has already been violence or controlling behavior, the moment one person attempts to leave can become a particularly tense and potentially dangerous period. That does not mean we can look back at the past and claim that Claire's death was certain to happen. No one could know that with certainty. But there is a significant difference between saying, no one could predict the future exactly, and saying, there were no signs worth paying attention to. In Claire's case, the reports from 2015 still existed. And 3 years later, they became an inseparable part of the story when people were forced to look back at everything that had happened. Perhaps that is what makes this case so thought-provoking. After a tragedy, we often look backward in time and try to find the decisive warning sign. One detail that, if someone had recognized it, might have changed everything. But reality is often more complicated than that. Risk does not always reveal itself through a single event. Sometimes, it exists in a pattern. A report, an act of violence, a period of escalating tension, a marriage falling apart, a growing sense that control is being lost, and eventually, those separate pieces begin to form a pattern. That may be the deeper lesson left behind by this case. Not that we should look at every troubled marriage and immediately conclude that a tragedy is about to happen, but that violence should not always be evaluated through isolated incidents alone. One act may appear small when viewed by itself, but when it is repeated, escalates, and appears alongside other warning signs, looking at the entire pattern becomes more important than ever. Andrew later pleaded guilty to killing Claire. So the case was no longer centered on the question of whether he was responsible for her death, but his guilty plea could not erase the questions surrounding the causes, the events that led to the killing, and the warning signs that had existed beforehand. The deeper we look into this story, the harder it becomes to see the night of January 7 as a moment completely separate from the past. Because behind that night were years of a relationship. Behind the murder were warning signs that had appeared before. And behind the words written in official case files was a woman who had once tried to defend herself. But ultimately, all of that analysis leads back to one unchangeable truth. Claire did not survive. And now, the story moves into its final stage. No longer the crime scene, no longer the forensic evidence, but the courtroom, the place where Andrew Taverner would have to face the legal consequences of what he had done. But no matter how severe the sentence might be, one question would remain, one that no judge could ever answer. A sentence can bring a criminal case to a close on paper, but can it ever truly bring closure to what happened to the people left behind? On April 10, 2018, the story finally reached the place where Andrew Taverner could no longer escape the consequences of what had happened. Bristol Crown Court. A courtroom, a judge, and a man waiting to hear the sentence for the act that had taken his wife's life. Andrew Taverner had pleaded guilty to killing Claire. So by this point, the question was no longer whether he was responsible. That had already been established. The remaining question was, how would the law make him answer for what he had done? The sentence was life imprisonment. Andrew was ordered to serve a minimum of 16 years and 8 months before he could be considered for release. On paper, that marked the conclusion of the legal process. A sentence had been handed down. The case had been brought to a close in the eyes of the law, but for Claire's family, no court hearing could ever truly be called an ending, because a court can decide how many years of freedom Andrew will lose. But it cannot answer for the years of life Claire lost. It cannot bring her back to her family. It cannot give her 2 boys another morning of hearing their mother call their names. And it certainly cannot erase the day Rory and Blake's lives changed forever. Perhaps that is the greatest difference between justice and healing. Justice can establish responsibility. It can impose a sentence. It can declare that someone must face the consequences of their actions. But healing has no specific sentencing date. There is no moment when a victim's family walks out of a courtroom and suddenly finds that all the pain has disappeared. Some losses do not end when the sentence is read aloud. They simply enter another stage. A stage in which those left behind must learn how to continue living with an absence that can never truly be filled. Claire's family remembered her not through the words written in a case file. They remembered a woman who loved life, a daughter, a friend, a mother, and perhaps that is the most important thing to remember as this story comes to an end. Because in so many true crime cases, people can end up remembering the killer's name more clearly than the victims. They remember the sentence, the crime, the shocking details. But behind all of that was a real person who had a life long before she became a name in a news report. Claire Taverner was not born to become a character in a murder case. She had her own interests, a job, a family, and 2 young sons whom she loved. And then, in the space of a single night, her future was taken away. Perhaps that is why, when we look back at the entire story, we should return to where it all began. Not to the courtroom, not to the life sentence, but to a morning just before 7 a.m., a quiet house, a 6-year-old boy, and his 3-year-old brother standing beside him. A telephone, a desperate call for help. At the beginning of this story, it was a moment filled with mystery. But by the end, it becomes the most heartbreaking image of the entire case. Because Rory did not call 999 because he himself was in danger. He called because of his mother. He simply wanted someone to come and help. Perhaps, in that moment, he still believed that if he called the right people, everything could somehow be fixed. But there are some things that not even the police, doctors, or anyone else can reverse. Claire was gone. Andrew had to face his sentence. And Rory and Blake were left to grow up in a world where, from that day forward, their mother would no longer be there. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of this entire story. Because in the end, a criminal case can be closed. A file can be archived. A sentence can be handed down. But the consequences never exist only inside a courtroom. They continue to live on in the lives of those left behind. The story of Claire Taverner is not simply the story of a murder. It is also a story about warning signs that became clearer only in hindsight. A marriage that was falling apart, warnings that had appeared before, and one morning when 2 young children were forced to confront a reality far too overwhelming for their age. After everything, what should remain is not simply the name of the man who committed the crime. What deserves to be remembered is Claire, a woman who was only 27 years old, a life cut tragically short. A mother who would never have the chance to watch her 2 sons grow up. And perhaps that is the final question this case leaves with all of us. When a tragedy has happened, we may be able to find justice. But can we ever truly recover what has been lost?